The limousine's tires screeched as it slid to a stop, the headlights illuminating the dimly lit alleyway. A man in a sharp suit, his face expressionless, stepped out. His name was Ethan Carter, a millionaire by any standard, wealthy, influential, and ready to marry the woman of his dreams. But as he stood there in the cold night air, something about this moment felt wrong. He looked down at the crumpled figure crouched in the shadows, his heart racing. A homeless boy, barely in his teens, dirty and disheveled, stood up and approached Ethan, his eyes sharp, desperate, locked with the millionaire's. "Don't marry her," the boy rasped, voice trembling with urgency. Ethan froze. The words struck him like a punch to the gut. "She's betraying you," the boy continued, stepping closer, his hands shaking. "I know who she really is. I can prove it." The night felt suddenly colder. The weight of the boy's words hung in the air, more suffocating than the chill of winter. Ethan's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts crashing together. His fiancée, the love of his life. Could it be true? The boy's next words would change everything. But would Ethan believe him? The penthouse was a kingdom, perched high above the chaos of the city below. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the sprawling skyline, bathed in the golden light of a setting sun. Ethan Carter, a man whose name resonated in boardrooms and luxury suites across the world, stood at the center of his domain, staring out at the city he had conquered. His reflection in the glass was sharp, confident, almost unyielding, like the life he had built from nothing. At 34, he was everything the world admired. A self-made millionaire, an innovator, a leader. Yet, tonight, even the wealth that surrounded him felt like an empty shell. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of a crystal tumbler filled with aged whiskey. The glass gleamed in the fading light, as if mocking him for the emptiness he couldn't escape. Ethan turned away, letting the cool, heavy weight of the room close in around him. His life, his future, was about to change forever. In just a few hours, he would marry Cassandra Lang, the woman who had captured his heart and soul. A woman of unparalleled beauty, grace, and sophistication. The crowd that would gather at the ceremony would be filled with the city's elite, those who admired them both. To them, the union of Ethan and Cassandra was the perfect culmination of two forces of nature, a partnership bound for greatness. Yet, a strange knot tightened in Ethan's chest. This day, this moment, felt off. As the night began to fall, he glanced at his watch, aware that time was slipping away. Tonight was supposed to be the beginning of forever. But, for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt as though something vital was about to shatter. The tension in the air that night wasn't just in the polished halls of Ethan's penthouse. It lingered in his conversations, in the glances exchanged between him and Cassandra, who had arrived earlier in the evening. On the surface, they were a perfect couple, the epitome of success. But behind the gleaming smiles and whispered promises, something uneasy simmered beneath the surface. Ethan had noticed it that morning, when Cassandra's hand had brushed against his at breakfast. Too quickly, too deliberately. She hadn't looked at him then, her eyes glued to the phone in her hand, fingers scrolling at a pace that betrayed something hidden, something she didn't want him to see. When he asked her if everything was all right, her response was as polished as her perfectly styled hair. "Of course, darling, everything's fine." But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. He had known Cassandra for years, but in the last few months, a growing distance had crept in. Her laughter, once spontaneous and genuine, had become more forced. Her touch, once electric, now felt absent. Ethan could no longer ignore the subtle shifts in their relationship, the little things that had started to nag at him, unspoken but ever-present. And then there were the late-night calls. Those hushed conversations that she always took in private, her voice low, too low, as though she were hiding something, someone. When he asked her about them, she always waved it off, claiming it was business. But Ethan had a gut feeling, one he couldn't quite explain, that something wasn't right. In the midst of the chaos and preparations, he found himself retreating into his own thoughts, his own doubts. Was he truly blind to the woman he had chosen to marry? Or was his success, his empire, making him miss the signs that were right in front of him? As the evening wore on, the question that plagued him grew louder. What if he was making a terrible mistake? Cassandra Lang had always played her cards close to her chest, but tonight, in the solitude of Ethan's penthouse, her true intentions were beginning to surface. She stood by the grand, ornate mirror, adjusting her dress for the evening. The shimmer of diamonds around her neck caught the light, but her eyes, cold and calculating, told a different story. She wasn't here for love. She wasn't even here for the wealth or the influence that marriage to Ethan would grant her. No, Cassandra had her own game to play. Behind that radiant smile and poised elegance lay a woman whose ambitions extended far beyond what anyone could imagine. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop, and she glanced at the screen. The name Victor flashed in bold letters. A smirk curled at the edge of her lips as she answered the call. "You're sure?" she asked in a low, hushed voice. Her fingers drummed on the edge of the sink as she listened intently. Victor, her accomplice. The man she had met years ago, when she had first decided that the path to wealth wasn't through marriage to a man like Ethan but through manipulation and deceit. Victor was the key. He was the one who had arranged everything. Every little detail that Ethan couldn't see. The forged documents, the secret bank accounts, the private meetings. They had played him for months. And now everything was coming to a head. "We're almost there. Everything's in place." Victor's voice crackled through the phone. "Tomorrow the will is signed. We can move forward." Ethan's blind to it all. Cassandra's fingers tightened around the phone, her nails biting into her palm. Almost there. Her mind wandered to Ethan, who would be waiting for her at the altar. He thought he was marrying the woman of his dreams. But Cassandra's plans had always been bigger than him. And once he was out of the picture, she would inherit everything. His fortune, his businesses, his name, and no one would ever suspect her of anything. Not a soul. But there was one thing Cassandra hadn't accounted for. One unpredictable variable. Meanwhile, hidden in the shadows of the city streets, a boy, a homeless teen, was about to change everything. His name was Lucas. He wasn't much to look at. Ragged clothes, dirt streaked across his skin, and eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. But in his world, survival came with an uncanny ability to observe, to see things others didn't. Lucas had watched Cassandra for weeks. From his hidden corner in the city, he'd seen her slip in and out of Ethan's life, always with a smile, always pretending to be the perfect woman. But Lucas knew something was wrong. He had caught glimpses of her phone calls, overheard her plans, and had even seen the way she spoke with Victor, a man whose shadow loomed over their every interaction. It wasn't just curiosity that drove him to follow her that night. It was a feeling deep in his gut, one he couldn't ignore. Something dark, something dangerous was unfolding. And when he learned the truth, the entire city would shake with the force of it. Now, as he stood outside the gleaming tower where Ethan lived, Lucas felt the weight of the secret he had uncovered. He had spent days tracking Cassandra and Victor, piecing together the puzzle, and the pieces finally clicked. They weren't just planning a wedding. They were planning to ruin Ethan's life. Cassandra was using him, using Ethan as a pawn in a game that Lucas didn't fully understand but knew was wrong. He had to warn Ethan. He had to stop it. But how? A homeless kid, barely a teenager, against the wealthy, powerful elite? The odds were impossible. His hands trembled as he stared at the towering glass doors. But there was no time to hesitate. If he didn't act now, Ethan would be trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. Lucas's heart raced as he paced in front of the penthouse building. The plan was simple, or at least it seemed that way in his head. He would find Ethan, tell him everything, and expose Cassandra for the liar she was. But as he looked at the polished marble entrance, he realized just how impossible it seemed. He was a kid, a street rat. No one would listen to him. And yet, he couldn't just walk away. The thought of Ethan marrying Cassandra without ever knowing the truth tore at him. He'd seen how the millionaire's eyes lit up whenever he spoke of her. How he talked about her like she was his world. Ethan didn't deserve this. His first attempt was a disaster. He snuck into the lobby and found himself face to face with a security guard. His words stumbled out in a mess of nerves and desperation, and before he knew it, the guard was leading him back to the door. "Sorry, kid. No one gets in without an invite. Come back when you've got one." Lucas's stomach sank. How could he get through to Ethan now? How could he stop what was about to happen? Frustration gripped him. His mind raced. Think, Lucas, think. He couldn't back down now. If he didn't act, everything would be lost. So he tried again, slipping into the alley behind the building, looking for another way in. He found a fire escape ladder at the back, rusty but sturdy enough. It was his only chance. He climbed the rickety steps, heart pounding in his chest, fingers scraping against the cold metal as he reached the roof. But as he pulled himself up, a faint sound caught his attention. A whisper of movement. Someone was already up there. A figure stepped into view, a silhouette against the darkening sky. It was Cassandra, and she was staring right at him. The night air was thick with tension as Lucas and Cassandra locked eyes on the rooftop. The city's lights flickered below, casting long shadows across their faces, the silence between them suffocating. Lucas's heart hammered in his chest, his palms slick with sweat. He couldn't back down now, not when he was so close to the truth. But the icy glare Cassandra gave him sent a chill through his bones. "You," Cassandra said, her voice smooth, almost predatory. "I wondered when you'd finally catch up." Lucas could hardly believe it. This was the woman who had charmed her way into Ethan's life, his world, his future. And yet here she was, cold and calculating, her mask slipping. "I know what you're planning," Lucas said, his voice shaking, though he struggled to maintain his composure. "I know what you've been doing to him. You're using Ethan to get what you want." Cassandra tilted her head, a slow smile spreading across her lips. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone mocking, yet tinged with something darker. "And how do you know that, little boy? You're nothing but a street rat. You don't belong here." She took a step forward, and Lucas instinctively stepped back. He hadn't anticipated this level of confidence, this smugness. But in the pit of his stomach, he felt the unease. He knew what he had to do. "I know about the will," Lucas said, his voice now steadier, his words sharper. "I know you're planning to take everything from him. His money, his businesses, and you're going to leave him with nothing." At the mention of the will, Cassandra's eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Lucas saw it, a crack in her armor. "So, you're not as dumb as you look," she said, the edge in her voice sharpening. "What makes you think anyone will believe you? A homeless kid? Do you think Ethan will listen to you?" She took another step, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "You think you can ruin my plans? No one would ever believe a word you say." Lucas stood his ground, his jaw clenched, his fists trembling with anger. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had to make her see. "I'll tell him everything. I'll make him see you for what you are." Cassandra laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're too late," she whispered. "The wedding is tomorrow. It's all over. And you'll never make it out of here." In that moment, Lucas felt the full weight of her threat. She wasn't just an elegant woman playing a game. She was dangerous. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind him, and his mind raced. There was no way out, not unless he acted quickly. Lucas's eyes darted to the edge of the roof. The fire escape ladder was still there, just within reach. But Cassandra had closed the gap between them, and she wasn't letting him go that easily. "You really think you can stop me?" Cassandra's voice was almost a whisper now, her breath hot on his skin. "You don't belong here. You never will." For a second, Lucas's resolve wavered. It was true, wasn't it? Who would believe him? A homeless kid, no family, no resources, against a woman like Cassandra? She had power, wealth, and influence. She had already won. But then he remembered Ethan, the man who had given him a meal once, the man who had shown him kindness when the world had cast him aside. Ethan deserved better than this. He deserved to know the truth. Lucas took a deep breath, pushing away the doubt that threatened to cloud his mind. He had to act, and he had to act now. With a burst of speed, Lucas darted for the edge of the rooftop. Cassandra's hands shot out to grab him, but he was faster. He reached the ladder, scrambling down it with all his might, the sharp clink of metal echoing in his ears as he descended into the alley below. He heard Cassandra's voice, distant but full of rage. "You can't run from me forever." Lucas didn't stop. He couldn't. He ran through the darkened streets, his legs burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced with the weight of what he had just uncovered. He had to find Ethan. He had to make sure he knew the truth before it was too late. The streets blurred around him as he ran. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, but he didn't slow down. Ethan had to hear his warning. He had to know what was coming. It wasn't long before Lucas found himself standing in front of the towering glass doors of Ethan's building once again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He pushed his way through, past the guards, past the lobby, straight to the elevator. He wasn't going to let anyone stop him. As the elevator ascended, Lucas could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. This wasn't just about saving Ethan's wealth or his business. It was about saving him from a life of betrayal and misery. The elevator doors opened to Ethan's floor. And there, standing in the hallway, was Ethan. He looked surprised to see him, maybe even confused. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with disbelief. I need to talk to you," Lucas said, his voice trembling. But there was no time for doubt. He couldn't hold back any longer. "You need to know the truth about Cassandra." Ethan frowned, his face hardening. "What are you talking about?" "Cassandra and I. She's going to destroy you." Lucas cut in, his words urgent. "You don't know her. She's not who you think she is. She's been using you. She's already planned everything, the will, the money, everything. She's taking it all." Ethan's expression shifted, from confusion to anger to something darker. He took a step forward, as though to brush Lucas off, but Lucas stood his ground, staring up at him. "Don't you see? She's already won," Lucas said, his voice raw, desperate. "Tomorrow it will be too late. She's been manipulating you this whole time." For a long moment Ethan didn't speak. His eyes narrowed, as though processing the words that had just shattered the illusion of his perfect life. His gaze shifted to the door behind Lucas, the door to his penthouse. Lucas knew that was where Cassandra was waiting. But would Ethan believe him? Suddenly the door opened, and there she was, Cassandra, wearing that same perfect smile, the same look of confidence. But this time, something in Ethan's eyes had changed. The mask had cracked. The illusion was breaking. "Ethan, darling?" Cassandra cooed, stepping forward. "What's going on?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. And then, in a low, almost detached voice, he said, "It's over." Cassandra's smile faltered, just for a second. But that was all Lucas needed to know. The truth had finally come out. The truth hit Ethan like a thunderclap. His world, once built on trust and ambition, crumbled before his eyes. The wedding that was supposed to be the culmination of his dreams now lay in ruins. Cassandra, the woman he had loved and believed in, stood before him, her lies exposed, her mask slipping away. As the doors slammed shut behind her, Ethan stood in the middle of his penthouse, staring into the empty space that felt suddenly so cold. He could still hear the echo of her footsteps fading down the hall, but it didn't matter. What was left was the emptiness of betrayal. Lucas had been right. All along, the signs had been there. Those little moments, the subtle hints of distance, the coldness in Cassandra's eyes when she thought no one was watching. But Ethan had ignored them, blinded by the vision of the future she'd promised him. He had been a fool. Now, standing alone in the silence, Ethan felt a weight pressing down on his chest. His thoughts were a storm, racing and colliding. How had he not seen it? How had he not felt it? All the years of building his empire, of striving for success, he had done it all for the wrong person. He had given his heart to a woman who was only ever after his wealth. She had planned everything. She had made him a pawn in her game. The pain was sharp, but it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the realization that his own judgment had failed him so completely. He had trusted the wrong person, had given his life to a lie. The humiliation gnawed at him. But there was something else too. A deep, suffocating loneliness that stretched in every direction. For the first time in years, Ethan felt small. The weight of the mansion, the money, the power, it didn't matter. All those things were meaningless now, hollow in the face of what had just transpired. The love he had once felt for Cassandra, the future they had planned together. It was all a lie, a carefully crafted illusion. Ethan sank down onto the couch, his face buried in his hands. He couldn't stop the tears. The betrayal wasn't just a shock. It was a wound that would take a long time to heal. But more than that, it was the betrayal of his own heart. How could he ever trust again? The days following the confrontation felt like an endless blur for Ethan. The grand wedding that was supposed to take place never came to be, and Cassandra disappeared from his life as quickly as she had entered it. But the damage she had done lingered in the shadows, a silent reminder of the pain she had caused. It wasn't until Lucas returned to Ethan's life that things began to shift. The homeless boy, who had once been nothing more than a stranger on the streets, had become his anchor in a storm of doubt and grief. He had been the one to expose Cassandra's deceit, the one to risk everything to save him. Lucas had no reason to help Ethan, no obligation to be there for him. And yet, in the moment that mattered most, Lucas had stepped up, a quiet hero in the darkest of times. Ethan invited him to dinner one evening, wanting to show his gratitude. The setting was simple. No grand gestures, no expensive meals, just two people sitting across from each other, in a humble restaurant that didn't care about wealth or status. It was a far cry from the life Ethan had once known, but it felt right, felt real. "I don't know how to thank you," Ethan said, looking at Lucas across the table. "You saved me. You saved my life, my future." Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to the side. He wasn't used to gratitude, not this kind of gratitude. "I just did what needed to be done. You were in danger, and I couldn't stand by and watch you get hurt." Ethan smiled softly. "You didn't just save me from Cassandra. You saved me from myself, from making the same mistakes over and over. You reminded me that there's more to life than just money and power." Lucas paused, his gaze meeting Ethan's. There was an intensity in his eyes, a quiet depth. "I never had those things," he said quietly. "But what I know is that no matter how much you have, it won't save you from the people who don't care about you." it won't stop them from using you. The real wealth is in the people who care about you, who stick around when things get hard. Ethan's throat tightened. Lucas was right. In a world full of betrayal, Lucas had shown him something he'd long forgotten. True friendship, loyalty, and the strength to stand up when everything else seemed to fall apart. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began to rebuild. Not just his business or his life, but his sense of self. He cut ties with the toxic people in his life, including those who had once been his closest allies. But it was Lucas who remained by his side, a constant, steady presence in a world that had lost its sense of direction. The bond between them grew stronger. Lucas had always been more than just a homeless boy. He was someone who had seen the worst of life and still managed to hold on to his humanity. And Ethan, for all his wealth and success, had forgotten what truly mattered. Through Lucas, Ethan learned to find redemption not just in wealth or status, but in the people who helped him rise again. And in return, Lucas found a mentor, someone who believed in him, someone who was willing to offer him the opportunities he had always dreamed of. In the end, it wasn't just Ethan who had been saved. Lucas had been given a chance to transform his life, to find his place in the world, and to believe in something bigger than himself. As they sat together, sharing stories of their past and their hopes for the future, there was a quiet understanding between them. They had both been broken, both had been betrayed. But now, they stood together, stronger and more determined than ever before. And as the evening came to a close, Ethan clapped Lucas on the back with a grin. "You know, you're not just a hero, you're family." Lucas smiled back, a rare, genuine smile that spoke of hope and new beginnings. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, they both felt ready for whatever came next. In the end, the true wealth was never found in money, power, or status. It wasn't in the things that glittered or the people who faked loyalty. The real treasures were the lessons learned along the way, the value of trust, the strength in standing up against betrayal, and the power of true friendship. Ethan's journey showed us that no matter how high we climb, the people who care for us are the ones who hold the most worth. Lucas, the homeless boy who had nothing, proved that sometimes the most unexpected people are the ones who can change your life forever. He reminded us all that courage isn't always about making grand gestures. Sometimes, it's in the quiet act of choosing to do what's right, even when it's hard. Through pain and loss, redemption is found in the strength of the relationships we build, not in the wealth we accumulate. In the end, it's love, loyalty, and human connection that save us from the darkest of times. If you've been moved by this story of betrayal, redemption, and true friendship, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales that will inspire and touch your heart. Join us in uncovering more journeys of courage and transformation. Subscribe now, and be part of our community.